welcome back to our second day, and we've had two great panels already. It's my great honour to welcome John Street and Oskar Jensen today, and for our second distinguished talk. John Street is an emeritus professor of politics at the University of East Anglia, and for several decades has been at the forefront of research in politics and music. As well as authoring 7 books and around 80 articles, John was co-editor with Simon Frith and Will Straw of the Cambridge Companion of Pop and Rock in 2011. He's a long-standing member of the editorial for the Journal of Popular Music. Right, so? As reflected in his many publications, such as Music and Politics from 2011, John's research theorises on the connection between music and politics, analysing the various components of social, political, economic and aesthetic eco-interests that shape and reflect this relationship. John's been recently, he has been the principal investigator of the project Our Subversive Voice, the history and politics of the English protest song, an AHRC project that ran from 2020 to 2022. This is a website containing 750 songs. It's an amazing resource with lyrics, commentaries, audio examples and essays, and also a very useful extensive literature list. And this is where Oskar comes in. Oskar's been part of that project as one of the core members. Oskar is an NUACT Fellow in Music at Newcastle University, where he's working on the project The Invention of Pop Music, mainstream song, class and culture from 1520 to 2020. It's quite a range.
Probably updated to 22, 23.
Okay. Oskar is originally a historian. His book Vagabond's Life on the Streets of 19th Century London from last year has recently been shortlisted for the prestigious Watson History Prize. Other books include The Ballad Singer in Georgian and Victorian London, and Napoleon and British Song from 1797 to 1822. As well as being co-editor of a special edition of the Journal of British Studies entitled Music and Politics in Britain in 2021. Oskar is a founder member of the Romantic National Song Network and the 19th Century Song Club, and is an AHRC BBC New Generation thinker and novelist. So, please give a big warm welcome for John Street and Oskar Jensen.
Thank you, Dave, for those kind words, and thank you for the invitation, and also to Yanis and to Chris back there, and Maria for the support. And thank you, the audience, for showing up, and I realise we stand between you and lunch, and so I will hope lunch doesn't seem too long delayed. This conference is about many things, but one of them is what the protest song is, what form it takes, what it does, and how it might or should be studied. We hope that what follows will provide one set of answers amongst many to how those questions might be answered. Oskar and I are going to talk about the protest song associated, as Dave has indicated, with one place, England, but about the many forms it has taken within that one location over more than 400 years, and about how we have borrowed from music studies, history, and political science to do so. None of this would have been possible, as Dave has also mentioned, without the generous financial support of the Arts and Humanities Research Council, but more importantly, thanks to the research team. Oskar and I are just 1/3 of that team. Other members are my colleague at UEA, Alan Finlayson, who's a specialist in political rhetoric, Angela McShane from Warwick University, who's a specialist in early modern song, amongst other things. Matt Worley from Reading, who is a historian of the 20th century, its politics and its music and its subcultures. And finally, by no means least, Helen Stokes, whose job title was Events Organiser, which woefully fails to reflect the work she did to bring our project to life and to make it accessible to a wider public. Our project, as Dave has also mentioned, is called Our Subversive Voice, the History and Politics of the English Protest Song. There used to be a question mark after voice. Our subversive voice? But But 3 years on, I think we are agreed that the protest song is indeed a form of subversion, and as such does things in and to politics, both as ideas and as action. The project itself began as a casual conversation in which we identified two perceived absences. The first being a no sustained account of the English protest song as compared to, say, the American variant. And the second absence was the lack of any recognition of the protest song in what passes as political communication. Now, these are perceived absences, and this room contains people who might question our rather naive initial assumptions. Anyway, those assumptions gave rise to an ambition to fill those gaps by tracing the English protest song not from the 20th century to the present day, but from the 17th century, and the market that was formed at that time in songs in London. Beyond this, we wanted our study to explore how the protest song worked as a form of political communication, how it was both different from and similar to sermons, pamphlets, speeches, and other forms of political expression. How to do this in 2 years. It was simple enough to decide upon the need for a team that combined politics, history, music studies, and so forth, and it was good luck, our good luck, to find a group of people who shared our ambition and who are still speaking to each other. It was also easy to decide that a significant part of the project would be devoted to public-facing events, some of which we had anticipated, the website, exhibitions and concerts, and some we hadn't anticipated, a theatre production and a weekend residence at the Latitude Music Festival. If you want a definition of happiness, it's an academic at a music festival wearing a lanyard that says performer. Rather less easy was deciding what we actually meant by a protest song. A long and tiresome definition, which I authored, was dropped from the bid, and I'm sure did a lot to help get it funded. And harder yet was the task of which songs from the period, from 1600 to 2020, we were to include, which is my cue to hand over to Oskar.
Thank you. Can you all hear me if I go off mic? Because I need to reach this thing over here. We've set this up in a context. Okay. Thank you. I should also actually say thanks to Matt Martin, the designer who collaborated with us on the website. If you ever want an amazing designer who will very much tell you when you are wrong and what I think should be better, thoroughly recommend him. And thank you again to everyone for having us here. I enjoyed this project once it had been funded, and much like all of you, I imagine I had quite a lot of questions for John and the rest of the team. Among them were, just English? Seriously? Well, yes, but it's complicated. Why start in 1600 when you could go back even further? We'll get to that. Do chants count? No, apparently. We've got to draw the line somewhere. Songs of protest or songs during protest? Songs of protest, because rhetoric is a central concern to the project, and I think one of the things we're doing that's more innovative. And of course the question, so what is a protest song? It took us about 6 months to answer that last one to something like our own. I've written like something like our own satisfaction. I'm not sure that's true, and certainly not anyone else's. At one point I even created this. You can't, you're going to have to zoom out on this one. You don't have to read it. This was meant to be a joke, actually, and then it sort of started to work. I'm not going to go into this decision tree or flowchart now. It starts, incidentally, with attempting to clarify song, which was not the easiest of the whole thing. On our website, as Dave says, we have 750 of those things. Some don't have known tunes, whilst one, Timber by Coldcut, doesn't have any words, although it is extremely eloquent, I think. We may have got a little bit off-piste with our sort of internal discussion, so it might be worth canvassing some expert opinion and seeing if you agree with us. I'd like a show of hands, please. What have we been hearing about this morning? Ethel Smythe's March of the Women, well, half of us have. Ethel Smythe's March of the Women, a protest song. Do we think? Hands for protest song. Okay, those of you who've heard of it, I think have put all over there, putting your hands up. I think that's an easy one as a suffragette standard, but its lyrics are entirely dependent on context. Read in isolation, they don't actually protest about anything, but in its time, in its purposes, very much protest. Okay, Rule Britannia from 1740. Anyone for rule? Any takers for Rule Britannia? See, no hands. We think it's on our list. his father's court, protesting Britain's foreign policy and advocating a sea change, very literally, in its diplomatic stance. Plus, along with God Save the King, which is also on our list, it led to dozens of other protest songs that made use of that tune in all sorts of causes over the years that followed. The original was a very niche, very aristocratic, very high political protest. It was nonetheless explicitly a protest song. The Marseillaise from 1792, is this an English protest song? Anyone going to agree with me? Okay, we've got a couple of... I'm going to say it's not a French protest song, but it is an English one. Immediately translated and published in England as the Marseille March, it went on to soundtrack a century of radical Chartist and socialist protests all over this country. In France in 1792, it's a soldier's song on the march. It's support for a regime that is now established. Over here, it's taken up immediately by radicals as a counter to what's going on and an application for a Jacobin policy in England. Blowing in the wind. Okay, blowing in the wind. Anyone? You're just now very sceptical. And no, okay, we've got one. We said no because it completely fails this test. It gets lost about halfway down on the right-hand side. In America, its choice of tune, taken from the Black Spiritual No More auction block, I think would see it count, by our definition. But that resonance, I think, is almost entirely lacking in England. But just trust the process. Two more. The Red Flag, an English protest song? Any hands? Lucy says yes. That was a trick question. We are keen on the 1889 song by Irishman Jim Connell for its take-up, and in fact it was written in London. But I meant the Red Flag by Alfred Fennell in 1850, a bloodthirsty Republican anthem, which is about as English and protesty as they come. Finally, The World is Turned Upside Down. Protest song, anyone? Stan, you've got to have, we've got to mix. Yes, especially because I mean Martin Parker's song of 1646, which is an anti-Puritan protest song about the cancelling of Christmas. It's our second Christmas song that we've had in the last 24 hours. Okay, enough self-indulgence from this list. Hopefully that should give you a brief flavour both of the sorts of songs we've been dealing with and some of the criteria involved in coming up with a corpus of songs stretching from roughly 1600 to 2020, which was when we started. This corpus is a curated selection, nothing scientific, and of course it's on the website subversivevoice.com. This is the next thing to showcase from it. We focused on 250 in particular, starting in 1603, but strictly speaking, this should have been the first one. It's the first commercially published protest song, Thomas Deloney's 1596 ballad, a complaint of the great scarcity and want of corn in the realm. It's a highly effective song, written by one of the first truly professional and celebrated songwriters of the whole period. It led to Deloney's imprisonment as a direct consequence of writing this song, and the destruction of every known copy. But it did work, or at least it helped. In response, the authorities took positive action over the grain supply and distribution in London. They effectively acquiesced to the song's demands due to the public protests it was causing. Alas, the general destruction of song sheets by governments, by consumers, by fire, by worms, mean that the survival rates of commercial ballads are very poor for this very early period, so no instance of it survived, so we couldn't really talk about it much. From the 1620s, the survival of songs widens out the issues being protested, encompassing the socio-economic, European diplomacy, even the consequences of selfish parenting, which is very much a society-wide issue, in The Lamentation of Mrs. Page's Wife of Plymouth from 1624. Soon after that, songs of protest, many of which were accompanied by dangerous and direct actions, such as marches and petitioning, were dominated by issues such as threats to Protestantism, the ravages of plague, food shortages, and the intense political crises that led up to civil war, regicide, Republican government, restoration, plots, crises, and a supposedly glorious revolution. Basically, all the good stuff, and a reason why Angela, were she here, would very much say, why are we not talking about the 17th century more as the centre of English protest song, or more generally, it's when the stakes are highest, it's when the issues are at their height. Indeed, a passing knowledge of English high political history will supply the context for a lot of our songs over the centuries, from the pro-Stuart Jacobite rebellions, to agricultural enclosure, the French Revolution, to the Peterloo Massacre of 1819, Chartism, socialism, suffragettes, hunger marchers, Oswald Mosley's fascists and their 1980s revivalists, because the far right had its protest songs too, the atom bomb in Vietnam to the Falklands and Iraq wars, the miners' strike and the Brixton riots of the early to mid-1980s, to Brexit in 2016 and the COVID lockdowns just sneaking in at the end of that period. It would be too simplistic, however, to present a simple correlation between an event-centred, almost picture-book version of English political history and the story of protest songs. That risks, I think, the songs becoming merely illustrative, something none of us want to do. Thinking chronologically then across this 420 years, it might be more interesting first to consider how the political conditions of English society and the balance of power relations within it have determined which political songs, which vastly outnumber protest songs, have been songs of protest. And this is not just a pedant's attempt to categorize, but a way, I think, of tracing the trans-historical shifts in the currents of political discourse, power, and, as John said, its communication. We could begin etymologically, because etymology is fun, by considering the terms employed by historical actors themselves. Although applicable, we would argue, across time and context, the label of protest song or protest singer has been claimed by very few, except singer-songwriters in the Woody Guthrie, Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, or perhaps in the UK, the Ewan MacColl, Billy Bragg, Grace Petrie tradition. Even within these last few decades, and the decades referred to there, Joan Armatrading, who has multiple songs on our list, has repeatedly rejected the name of protest singer. As Mark Philp notes, the term protest, like politicians and politics, is contingent upon historical circumstance. Just like the word democracy, the idea of politician and politics is a very dirty word in the late 18th century, for example. The idea of a legal written protest predates our period, hence, of course, Protestant. Whereas the modern idea of a protest, involving collective action and public demonstration, but within the framework of the law, dates only from the 1850s, with the associated verb to protest following 2 decades later even than that. It would take a century longer than this, until 1953, to link songs to that specific action in the English language, but I do have to shout out to Dave and his colleague Eckhart John for identifying a protest lead for Schleswig-Holstein from 1848. I think you're clear that's very much a one-off, not to be repeated. Nonetheless, it's not historically insensitive, I think, to describe much earlier songs, written, published, performed, especially by individuals, as protest songs. Because as early as 1550, one could protest against something in public, orally, and in writing. That is there within the framework of the language, the lexicon, within the mentalities of people at the time. So at the start of our period, such songs were, however, labelled often a complaint or a lamentation as part of this sort of wider vocabulary, remonstration, exhortation. These words having much less passive connotations, complaint and lament, than they do today. Especially because any assertion of a dissenting voice in public before the Enlightenment era and the whole idea of public opinion maybe being formed in the 18th century as legitimate was an extraordinary action to take, especially on the part of the disenfranchised in the 17th century. Throughout this early period, at least until 1714, when the last of them, maybe the Gentle Crafts Complaint, a shoemaker ballad, is published, those terms lamentation and complaint, adopted self-consciously by the writers and publishers of the song, were mostly associated with songs of socio-economic protest, conceptually linked to the prevalent culture of petitioning for redress. The terms continued to be used on and off until 1856, is the last one we found, but they swiftly became a lot less common. With the exception of a handful of laments in the years after Waterloo, the hand loom weaver's lament, I think, is still quite famous and quite a strong protest song people sing today, and those were associated with certain trades. But they were more generally used in a more knowing, almost satirical fashion to give an effective titular weight to songs that protested issues of all kinds. Like this one, the American War of Independence, recounting its lamentation on the devastation of war. Or abolitionism, the Negro's Complaint of 1788. We'll come back to this one. The Sailor's Complaint, which is about naval mutinying in 1797, the spearheaded Nor mutinies, and violence in the workhouse, the women floggers' lament of Marylebone Workhouse. Though extremely rare, the persistence of these titles indicates, I think, a continued perception, not of a musical genre of such, obviously, but of a recognizable tradition of a particular form of songwriting, sought to make a political intervention from a subordinate and aggrieved perspective. In fact, that's not a bad generalization of our protest songs, I think. Written by people who are pissed off and who want to do something about it. Having found these songs, that's as close to an assertion of the definitions we're going to get. Having found these songs, though, there are many ways we can interrogate them in relation to their long history, in terms of their thematic content, writers, rhetorical tactics, the conditions that allowed them to be created and heard, and the forces that have sought to suppress them. But we also wanted to ask not just what the study of history can do for the protest song, but what the protest song could do for the study of history. And one of the biggest insights I think they've afforded is that this great sizable chunk of English history, which in many cases becomes global history by dint of imperial violence, 1600 to the present, falls pretty neatly into three distinct eras. 1600 to 1789, 1789 to 1945, and 1945 to the present. We think some of you may have heard of those dates before, and we admit those periodizations are not entirely unfamiliar. We could even call them the early modern, modern, and contemporary, because post-war obviously makes no sense in English history, where peace is the exception rather than the rule. Thematically, the preoccupation of each era is distinct. But it's the ways in which the songs themselves change, in their form, their performance, their methods of distribution, that really seems, I think, to be telling us something interesting. Especially because, like the structure of so many of these songs themselves, it's not a linear narrative, but an A-B-A chronology. The early modern and the contemporary eras closely resemble each other, and the modern bit in the middle forms an exception. So the first and the third of these eras are dominated by protest songs that both operate within the parameters of the established commercial music industry and that talk to an audience. Their voice and their mode of performance is generally that of an individual performer seeking to instruct, persuade, critique. So before 1789, our typical protest song is a strophic street ballad, published by a commercial printer and both sold and in the first instance performed by a solo street ballad singer. If the author of the song is known, they are more than likely someone who is used to writing in this medium of street song for immediate remuneration. Not a die-hard activist committed to a cause, but an experienced songwriter who is being paid for their lyrics, turning their hand to politics as part of a far wider portfolio. Take the Goodfellows' Complaint from 1647. It's an anonymous commercial broadside ballad. It's 20 verses long, taking anything up to 15 minutes to sing, depending on what pace you set it, written to the tune of Old Simon the King, it's a great tune, and subtitled in rather obscure syntax, who being much grieved strong liquor should, in paying a farthing a pot for excise. It protests the new parliamentary excess being levelled on ale and beer, and accompanied a number of riots in opposition to this much resented new tax. If you want to look at the various taxes that have been grossly hated across English history, forget the poll tax. Charges, forget window tax or beer, wig tax. Charges on beer strikes right to the heart, I think, of what ordinary people care about in this country. I'm putting it to Nigel Farage, I'll stop that. But this song, it whipped up its protesters via the established commercial ballad industry, and it was sung, sold and distributed by professional ballad singers standing on street corners. A lone voice addressing the crowd, exhorting, cajoling, persuading by means of a very much extended lyrical argument addressed in second person to the listeners. Come here, all of you. We get it, I mean, anyone familiar with Irish song, that sort of beginning, come all you, very much that addressed to the person. In the era from 1945, allowing for technological innovation, which, there's some over that time period, the picture is much the same. Except the songs are no longer anonymous on the whole. They're still written by commercial artists as part of a wider oeuvre. They're published by record labels, and they're consumed in both recorded and live environments where there's a clear division on the whole between the performer and the audience. In both eras, I'm doing 420 years of history, there's a lot of generalization going on, but sort of go with me here, I think this does obtain on the whole. In both eras, though the rhetoric of the song may seek to deny the distinction between the two, performer and audience, the generic conditions still impose themselves, one voice speaking to many ears. Indeed, the closer we come to the present, the more these songs start to resemble those of the early modern era. Dave's Question Time from 2017 is a case in point. Co-written with producer Fraser T. Smith, featuring as the lead single on Dave's second EP, Game Over, its 6 densely patterned verses last just over 7 minutes, which in fact is much more comparable to most of these ballads from the 17th century. Written in the wake of London's 2017 Grenfell Tower fire and at Brexit, the song holds then Prime Minister Theresa May to account, as well as challenging both her predecessor and the leader of the opposition, as the lyrics range across a number of connected state-of-the-nation issues. In its approach, in its form, in its moral critique of those in power, as well as in its commercial conditions and its reception by individual purchasers, it's one of many recent protest songs, irrespective of the musical genre in which they exist, that remind us, at least powerfully, of the early modern. In between, however, this continuity gets massively disrupted. I've just search hymn in our list, so by coincidence they are all going to be in between. That's not bad. That's not a bad selection. We tag things for various characteristics. Though still written necessarily by individuals, songs are not written by communities. Individuals who are increasingly being identified, the modern era songs of 1789 to 1945 are more typically concerned less with talking to than with giving voice to the collective. And they are typically authored and disseminated in non-professional circumstances. Unpaid writers, subsidised publication, orchestrated distribution, and often curation within dedicated songbooks. Typically these are songs for communal rendition. Hymns, anthems, marches, these things much more than ballads or pop songs. The we they often invoice is meant to be realised literally in the moment of performance, sung by a multitude, in unison, or even in harmony. And of course this maps directly onto the self-organisation of the working class that is the dominant political narrative of this era, one inextricable from the musical organisation of working class voices in singing societies, choirs, bands, the brass band movement is analogous, and by the tonic sol-fa movement and its competitors. The era of the monster meeting, the strike, the march, and above all, the union, and is the era of the collective, non-commercial protest song. And the reversion to the single-voiced commercial model in the third era is, I think, in some ways quite eloquent of the decline of English socialism and the triumph of capitalism. There were organised protests, marches, demonstrations, workers' collectives before and after the modern era, we know this, but the evidence of our songs indicates a clear link between the heyday of collective organisation and the articulation of collective forms of protest in song. Honest, we checked. This practice is epitomised by Joseph Meitz's hugely influential 1841 publication, Singing for the Million, which was published in London. He was a singing master from Trier who had been forced out of his homeland due to his radical politics. He developed a system of adult singing classes aimed at labourers, based on accessible tonic sol-fa principle rather than standard musical notation. And if you're not familiar with sol-fa, you are familiar with do, re, mi from The Sound of Music. It's that. And Meitz's own songs were not explicit protests, but he exemplifies the symbiosis between collectivist politics and collective singing. Self-expression and self-organisation were essential to both, and the development of bottom-up, often choral mass singing, marched hand in hand with that of unionisation, strikes, demonstrations. The importance of these methods is exemplified by the very long afterlife of one of our favourite songs from this era, 1832's The Gathering of the Unions, March and Song. With lyrics written by the influential reformer Harriet Martineau and set to music by her close friend at the time, it's complicated, Eliza Flower, 3 verses long and with a 2-line chorus, this was frequently sung at assemblies of up to, if you believe the figures, 200,000 protesters. On occasions such as the 7th of May 1832 monster meeting of unions at Newall Hill in Birmingham. But in later decades, when it became known as the anonymised Union Hymn, it was frequently printed in sol-fa notation, in socialist and union songbooks, to aid its mass rendition by collectives who saw it as a vehicle for powerful self-expression. And even in 1832, Flower and Martineau didn't distance themselves from its authorship. Martineau writes about it in her History of England, doesn't say she had anything to do with it. There's very clearly a sense that they wanted to be taken up as something that is owned, articulated by protesters. Changes in the form and performance context of protest songs also related to changes in their rhetorical identities. At its most reductive, the modern era might be characterised as the age of we, succeeding the early modern era's I-you model. The populace and the collective protest song invoice constituting a lyrical and legitimized we, rather than being appealed to as an audience or spoken on behalf of by the single-voiced orator-narrator of earlier ballads. What I think some of the socialists in the circle of William Morris get quite wrong in the very late 19th century is they're trying to do worker songs that re-adopt that distancing, and they have titles like, you know, or sort of, cheer up you boys, you know, come on my boys. They're just excruciating. Really are. Anyway, in the contemporary democratic era, the potency and importance of that we continues to be recognised. But where present, it's more often in tension with the literal circumstances of an often professional musician appealing to a crowd. So that the songs that I think are most likely to be recognised as authentic and embodying a collectivity are instead perhaps likelier to make that use of an I that is an individual that is heard to be standing in as a sort of avatar of the listener's own identity. A sort of indie rhetoric taking over, if you like, to the sense that, you know, people can very much identify with an example throughout this conference, right? Morrissey somehow being the unlikeliest avatar for oneself or one's own expression, despite being a very unusual sort of person, yet he somehow becomes sort of every teenager in a certain era, to certain people. In the era of recorded music, a bedroom-based or headphones-based listener is likelier, I think, to identify with the I than the we, partly because of that mode of transmission. Whereas the latter, the we's profundity, when intoned by 1,000 densely packed bodies assembled for a single purpose, is hard to overstate and I think really hard to replicate in the present age without that sense of sort of postmodern awareness intervening in what that moment really feels like. The predominantly commercial conditions of the first and third eras reinforce the sense of soapbox style of politics in play, which is less applicable to the interim, which is co-curated. And where commercial street ballads persisted into the modern era, so too did that related rhetorical mode. Likewise, some contemporary genres that valorize that communal experience and focus on sing-along choruses are more likely to retain the rhetorical hallmarks of that middle era. This sort of collaborative expression being epitomized in its purest form by short, repetitive slogans and chants, the force of which is at least as much in how they serve to bind their singers together as it is in the words they express. And this is one of the places in which punk occupies a very slippery status in relation to protest for us. By contrast, the highly individualized and extensive lyrical forms of much contemporary rap and hip-hop lend themselves to protest songs that, in their wordplay, allusions, elaborate arguments, and dense patterning, resemble the broadside ballads of the 17th century much more closely than they do anything in between, and that extends to the status of melody as a feature within those songs too. We might summarize this entire phenomenon in the simple proposition that the interrelation of political and musical participation has been the primary vehicle for the changes in political and musical form that give us our three eras. This is the point of a distant perspective. We have exceptions to this, but that larger trend, I think, there is an overwhelming case for it. And it's more interesting, I think, because it suggests something about the political agency of protest songwriters and protest singers that is distinct from the wider commercial and musical conditions within which they operated. Because far from diminishing in that middle modern era, the commercial music industry flourishes and expands massively, its audience expands massively. The turn to collective non-commercial protest songs does not therefore map onto the mainstream current of song production at all. It's tied instead to the specifically political character of that middle era, one of self-improvement, self-recognition, mobilization, solidarity, idealism. That's why 1789 is an unavoidable place really to start. It's true that in the mid-20th century, artist activists like Hugh and McCall sought to sustain the relevance and impact of non-commercial protest song, especially through the reframing and politicization of what they called folk music. As Poltergeist objecting to you. Even today we have plenty of activists writing non-commercial protest songs. As you can hear in interviews, you're not going to hear now, but you can go away and have some listening to interviews on our website with the likes of Sue Gilmurray, Kim Wei, and Sam Lee. But their impact on both their own peers and the historical record is, vastly diminished in comparison to the earlier period. And the protest songs that have managed to cut through, if you like, since 1945, have typically been those amplified by commercial conditions. A major label, a celebrity artist, a touring schedule, radio play, a Glastonbury headlight slot. We're pretty confident that the insights of this model tell us something, not just about the history of protest song, but about histories more broadly. Histories of communication, of political organisation, of political identity, of social cohesion. All of which which is why this project was started in the first place. At which point, I will stop talking and give you back to John.
Yeah, you will hear more of Oskar. That extraordinarily eloquent summary of everything that we've really done in the project leaves me only, I think, to tease out the other key term in our title, the history and politics of the English folk song. And what I want to do is just simply draw out some of the assumptions that are embedded in what we've heard about how we think the folk song interacts with politics, and to justify to us, funders and others, that we really are talking about political communication. It was a big theme of the bid as we designed it. And the point, of course, here is to try and avoid the kind of pitfalls that one inevitably falls into when talking about the folk song. Either you treat it simply as a musical manifesto, or you just have it as a kind of accompaniment to change, without it ever having any significant role. And what we wanted to try and do is to make the argument and to bring forth some of the evidence that will allow us to claim that the protest song is doing political work out there in the world. And that's why it's been so great to work with political rhetoricians, and even to say the word, over the last couple of years. Part of what we were doing was saying to those who might be interested in political communication, you should be listening to protest songs. And the reason we're doing that is because if you look at the literature on political communication, which is relatively recent, at least within my discipline of political science, has been concerned primarily with media and news content, and only relatively recently has incorporated film and television, like the thick of it or whatever. Music has played a much more marginal role in the story of how political communication operates. There are very notable exceptions, some of whom sit in this room. Music studies, by contrast, has a much longer and richer history of studying music's relationship to politics. Ian Petty's work on the relationship between music and human rights is one such example. And then there's the work of people who write cultural history, often using music as part of their narrative. And to echo what Lucy said this morning, the idea of music driving history. These are both ways of approaching the topic from which we have benefited and which we seek to add to. But when you come to study the protest song, you are faced with, I think, three particular challenges that music studies in particular have brought to the table. Now, just summarising very briefly, you'll probably be familiar with all of them. One, lyrics. The idea that lyrics are in some important sense the thing we should be studying is challenged by writers like Simon Frith and others who ask questions about what words are actually doing in songs, and when you're studying a protest song, the lyrics seem pretty important. So there's that problem. What are we doing when we look at the lyrics of the protest song? Second challenge with which we're confronted is in focusing on the protest song, we are more automatically engaging that other debate, which is why don't people study the mainstream music? Why do they always want to talk about Crass or The Fall? Why do they not want to talk about Wham or Celine Dion or Ed Sheeran? And what is the justification for valorising what is undoubtedly a minority taste over and above the mainstream? What is the justification for that kind of aesthetic judgment or political judgment? And work with people like Carl Wilson provoke you thinking about this. A third challenge is that challenge which I referred to earlier about the relationship between music and change in the world. It's certainly the case that in a lot of writing of narratives of music's role, it's there as a kind of companion to social and historical change. It's exogenously affected. In other words, music simply responds to things in the world. But writers like Richard Peterson and Jennifer Lehner and others are saying, hold it, that's not how music changes. Music changes because of internal processes, endogenous processes within the music industry and related institutions. And that's what explains why music changes. And indeed, it opens up the possibility of music being the cause of change rather than being the product of it. So Well, these three issues, the lyrics, the mainstream, causes of musical and social change, haunt anyone who's interested in the protest song. There is one form of music which the words seem of supreme importance. It's the protest song. If a protest song is almost by definition not especially popular, at least in market terms, exceptions are obviously Give Peace a Chance, Ghost Town, and of course Rich Men, North of Richmond. And what justifies an intense interest in this particular minority taste? And finally, of course, it does seem patently obvious that post-protest songs do appear, at least, to be a direct response to events in the world. Van Morrison's No More Lockdown wouldn't make a great deal of sense without some knowledge of something called COVID and the effects that it brought about. So we've got those problems. So the other two problems that someone who's studying protest songs and wanting to make them into political communication and political action is faced with those who deny the protest song is of any particular importance or value. Driel Marcus, in his new book, Folk Music, quotes the Little Sandy Review, describing the protest song as the nightmare of our folk art, equivalent to the muckrakers of the 1930s, the television commercial with its asinine jingles, the Pet Fest, no idea what that is, the Sousa March, and the football cheer. And David Hesmondhalgh, in rather more measured terms, in 2013, acknowledging that protest songs can be powerful, moving, and even inspiring, consigns them to a relatively minor part of the music of the world. And if you're not satisfied with the criticisms of the denialists, then you've got the declinists. People who are saying, well, maybe there was a time the protest song did matter. Can't talk about it with any seriousness in the modern era. It's a trope of media coverage, but it's also an argument made by Peter Manuel in the Online Music and Politics journal, in which he argues that the changing nature of political activism, together with a new aesthetic of ironic distancing, makes the protest song an irrelevance or an impossibility.